The knock on my window came at 11:47 at night. I know the exact time because I had been staring at the clock on my phone, watching the battery percentage drop, trying to calculate whether I could afford to leave the engine running for heat. The answer was no. The answer was always no now. So I had pulled my old work jacket over my shoulders like a blanket and told myself that 63-year-old men have survived worse than a cold November in a parking lot off Route 9. Then the flashlight hit my face. I sat up so fast I cracked my knee on the steering wheel. My heart was doing something it probably shouldn't do at my age. I rolled down the window with the manual crank. The truck was a 1998. Nothing automatic about it, and squinted into the beam. "Sir." The officer's voice was flat, professional. Not mean, not kind, just the voice of someone doing a job at midnight. "You sleeping here?" "Just resting," I said, which was what it was, technically. He looked past me into the cab, saw the duffel bag on the passenger seat, the paper bag from the gas station with 2 granola bars and a bottle of water, the pillow I'd taken from the last motel I'd stayed in 3 weeks ago, when I still had enough in my account to justify it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "License and registration, please." I handed them over. My hands were stiff from the cold, the way hands get when you're past 60 and the temperature drops below 40. I watched him walk back to his cruiser, and I thought about the last time I'd sat in a parking lot at night feeling this small. I couldn't remember one. In 40 years of working, building, failing, rebuilding, I had never once slept in a vehicle. I had been prouder of that fact than I probably should have been. 15 minutes passed. I watched it in the rearview mirror. He was still in the cruiser. That was longer than a routine check. I told myself it meant nothing. Old warrants for unpaid parking tickets, maybe. I'd lost track of a lot of paperwork in the last 8 months. 8 months. That's how long it takes to go from a corner office to a front seat of a truck. If you have the right people working against you. My business partner of 22 years was named Gerald Whitmore. We had built a structural engineering consulting firm together from nothing. 2 desks in a rented room above a dry cleaner in 1998. Then a real office. Then 3 offices in 2 states. At our peak, we had 41 employees and contracts with 4 county governments. I was the technical side. He was the client side. It worked because we needed each other. And for a long time, I believed that meant something. His wife joined the company in 2015 as our general counsel. I had raised a quiet concern at the time, not because I disliked her, but because it changed the balance. When the person who writes your contracts is married to the person who controls client relationships, you are operating on trust alone. My partner told me I was being paranoid. He said we were family. He said 22 years counted for something. I should have listened to the part of myself that knew better. The restructuring proposal came in February of last year. His wife had drafted it. My partner presented it with the same ease he used when pitching to clients. That particular blend of warmth and certainty that I had always admired in him. The proposal would shift ownership structure to bring in outside investors, he explained. It was a growth move. It would protect both of us from personal liability exposure. All I needed to do was sign the updated operating agreement. I read it. I'm an engineer. I read things carefully. But I am not a lawyer, and the language was dense in a deliberate way, the kind of dense that is designed to tire you out before the relevant clause. I found a sentence on page 14 that I didn't understand, and I asked about it. His wife explained it in a way that made me feel slow for asking. My partner laughed and said I always got hung up on the details. He said that was why he handled the clients and I handled the math. I signed it on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, I had received a formal notice that my ownership stake had been diluted to 4% under a provision I had apparently agreed to in Section 8, subsection C, Clause 3. The outside investor, I would later discover, was a holding company registered in Delaware with his brother-in-law's address. My attorney looked at what I'd signed and went quiet in the way attorneys go quiet when they are building toward bad news. She said I had options. She said fighting it would cost more than the recovery would yield. She said the agreement, as written, was enforceable. She said she was sorry. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my kitchen and tried to understand how 22 years could be converted into 4% in a formal letter. My wife had passed 4 years earlier. My son lived in Portland and had his own life. There was no one in the house to tell. I sat there until it got dark and I didn't turn the lights on. What followed is the part people don't understand unless they've been through it. The exit wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming match. No confrontation in a conference room. I was simply removed from operations over a period of 6 weeks through a quiet sequence of access revocations, reassignments, and one polite phone call from an HR manager who had been hired after me. My email stopped working on a Wednesday. My parking badge stopped working the following Monday. I had a box of personal items waiting at the front desk. My salary stopped. The retirement contributions the company had been making stopped. I had my personal savings and a 401k I couldn't touch without penalty. I hired a second attorney, then a third. Each one took a retainer and confirmed what the last one had said. The agreement was the agreement. I paid the mortgage for 3 months, then I couldn't anymore. The bank was polite about the foreclosure process in the way institutions are polite when they are doing something that will ruin you. I had 6 weeks to vacate. I packed what I could fit in the truck and I put the rest in a storage unit I paid for until I couldn't afford that either. The truck became the plan because it was the only plan available. I was 63 years old with an engineering degree, 3 decades of professional experience, and a blanket from a closet that used to belong to a house that used to belong to me. I applied for jobs. At my age, in my field, applications go into a specific kind of silence that is different from regular silence. I had 3 interviews in 8 months. None of them progressed. I took a temporary position doing quality inspection on a road project for a county subcontractor. It lasted 11 days before the contract ended. I did 3 weeks of overnight security at a warehouse. I was not too proud for it. I want to be clear about that. I was not too proud for any of it. I just couldn't get enough of it consistently enough to change the math. The Social Security office was my idea, and I'm not proud of the idea, but I was 63 and I needed to know what my options were. I had paid into the system for 40 years. Early filing at 62 meant a permanent reduction in benefits, and I had missed that window anyway, but I needed to sit across from a human being who could look at my actual record and tell me what existed. I needed to know the number. When you have nothing, numbers are something. I called and made an appointment. The earliest available was on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks out. I wrote it in the Notes app on my phone, because I no longer had a calendar. The officer was still in his cruiser. I checked my mirror again. The lights on his dash were on. He was on the radio, or the computer, or both. I tried to think of what would take this long. I had no outstanding warrants. I had never been arrested. The truck was registered and insured, barely, because letting insurance lapse was the kind of thing that turned a manageable problem into a catastrophic one, and I had enough experience with catastrophic problems to know that. I thought about my son. He didn't know I was living in the truck. I had told him I was in an extended stay while I sorted things out. He had offered money twice, and I had declined twice. And the third time he offered, I said I was fine and changed the subject because I could hear in his voice that he was worried, and he had a 2-year-old daughter now and the mortgage of his own, and I was his father, and fathers don't make their children carry them. The cruiser door opened. The officer walked back to my window. His expression had changed. Not dramatic, not alarmed, but the professional flatness was gone. He looked at me differently. The way you look at something when the category you put it in turns out to be wrong. "Mr. Callahan," he said. "That's me." He paused. "Sir, is your middle name Thomas?" "Yes." Another pause. "And your mother's maiden name?" I blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your mother's maiden name. Do you mind telling me?" I told him. "Hargrove. My mother had been Margaret Hargrove before she became Margaret Callahan, and she had died in 1994, and I had not said her maiden name out loud in a very long time." The officer looked at me with an expression I still don't have the right word for. Not pity. Not exactly. More like someone doing a math problem in their head and getting an answer they didn't expect. "Can you wait here for a few minutes, sir?" "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He went back to the cruiser. I watched him pick up the radio again. He spoke for a while. Then he was on his phone, actual phone, holding it to his ear. I could see him nodding. 18 minutes. I counted. When he came back, there was another officer with him. Older, plain clothes, a jacket with nothing written on it. He introduced himself as a detective with the county, which made no sense at all, and asked if I would mind stepping out of the vehicle to speak with him. I minded, actually. I minded quite a bit. I minded because I was cold and tired and 63, and I did not understand what was happening, and I had reached the point in this particular stretch of my life where not understanding things felt dangerous. But I got out. The detective asked me to confirm my full name, date of birth, social security number, and my mother's maiden name again. Then he asked me something I did not expect. "Mr. Callahan, are you aware that there's a flag on your file from the USPTO, the patent office?" "Yes, sir." I stood there in a parking lot at midnight in November, trying to remember something I had not thought about in over 30 years. The cold was making it harder to think. My knee still hurt from hitting the steering wheel. "I filed a patent application," I said slowly. "A long time ago. Early 90s. It was a method for calculating load distribution in composite materials. I was 28. I filed it myself, couldn't afford an attorney at the time. I don't think it ever went anywhere." The detective looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "it went somewhere. Here is what had happened, pieced together over the following 3 weeks through conversations with a patent attorney who took my case on contingency and a federal IP investigator who seemed personally offended on my behalf. The application I had filed in 1991 had been approved in 1993. I had received a notice. I had been 29, working long hours in a rented office above a dry cleaner, buried in the early days of what would become the business, and I had filed the notice in a folder and told myself I would deal with it when things settled down. Things did not settle down in the way young people always assume things eventually will. I forgot about it. The patent had sat dormant and valid under my name, and my name alone, for 11 years. In 2004, a manufacturing consortium in the Midwest had adopted a version of the load distribution method for prefabricated structural panels. Their engineers had discovered it through a patent database search and found it unencumbered. They had reached out to the address on file, which was my old rented office, now a hair salon. They had made a second attempt through the USPTO contact system. My old email address, from a provider that had gone under in 2001, was the address on record. Unable to locate the patent holder, the consortium had paid licensing fees into a USPTO escrow account. They had done this every year for 19 years because their legal department required it. Proper companies, dealing with a valid patent, paid what they owed even when the owner couldn't be found. 19 years of licensing fees from a consortium that had grown significantly since 2004. The flag on my file was a federal notification that unclaimed IP royalty escrow accounts past a certain threshold trigger an automatic inquiry process. The threshold had been crossed 2 years ago. The inquiry process, bureaucratic and slow, had been grinding forward through the federal system until it produced the flag that the officer had seen on his screen when he ran my license in a parking lot on a Tuesday night in November. The patent attorney sat across from me in her office. She had offered to meet me in a coffee shop, and I had declined because I was not ready to have this conversation somewhere. I might cry in public, and she put a number on a piece of paper and pushed it across the desk. I looked at it. I looked at it for a long time. "That's the escrow," she said. "Current balance. It's been accruing interest under federal escrow rules. The consortium also has an ongoing licensing renewal due in March. At current rates," she pointed to a second number she had written below the first. "That's the annual," she said. I had an engineering degree, and I was good with numbers, and I sat in that chair, and I could not make the numbers in front of me connect to the man who had been eating granola bars in a truck 3 weeks ago. "There's also," she said carefully, "the matter of your former business partner." I looked up. During the process of verifying your identity and ownership, she said, the IP investigator found a record of an inquiry made to the USPTO in 2019. Someone had attempted to file a claim of co-authorship on your patent. The claim was denied because the original application documentation clearly showed a sole inventor. But the inquiry itself is a matter of record. She paused. The inquiry was made through a law firm. The firm's registered counsel of record was a woman with your former partner's last name. I sat very still. That would be my former partner's wife, I said. Yes, she said. I thought you should know. They had known. At some point. Almost certainly when I was signing documents I didn't fully understand on a Thursday in February, his wife had been searching for what else I might own. She had found the patent. She had tried to claim it and failed, and she had never told me it existed. She had known what was sitting in federal escrow under my name, and she had built a wall of paperwork to separate me from it before I could find it myself. 22 years. I called my son that evening. He answered on the second ring, which he always does, which has always made me feel like I matter to him more than I deserve. I told him I needed to talk, and he said okay, and I drove to the diner near the highway because it was open late and warm, and I was so tired of being cold. I told him everything. The signing, the dilution, the truck, the parking lot, the officer, the patent, the numbers on the paper. He didn't say anything for a long time. My son is like his mother that way. He processes before he speaks. She had been the same. Then he said, "Dad, how long have you been in the truck?" "A few months," I said. "How many months?" I told him. He reached across the table and put his hand on my arm and said nothing, which was more than anything he could have said. We sat like that for a while. The diner had a pie case with 3 kinds of pie under the glass, and I had not eaten a real meal since the day before, and he ordered 2 slices of apple pie without asking me, and pushed one in front of me and said, "Eat," which is what his mother would have done. The legal process took 4 months. Patent attorneys and federal escrow releases, and a forensic accountant who documented the co-authorship inquiry for purposes my attorney described as options we want to preserve. The consortium was not adversarial. They had been waiting, quite literally, for me to show up. Their counsel was relieved in the specific way lawyers are relieved when a problem resolves itself cleanly. I did not return to the truck. My son drove up from Portland the day after the diner conversation and told me I was staying in a hotel until this was sorted out. I started to say something about pride, and he said he didn't want to hear it. He said pride was for people who hadn't spent 5 months in a truck, and that landed hard enough that I stopped talking. I do not know what Gerald Whitmore knows or when he knew it. My attorney has advised me not to speculate in any recorded form. The IP inquiry documentation is in the hands of people who do things with documentation like that, and what happens next is not something I am controlling. I have been told not to discuss the specifics. I am not discussing the specifics. What I am able to say is this. 40 years ago, I was 23 years old in a 1-bedroom apartment with a drafting table and a textbook on structural load theory and an idea about how composite materials bear weight differently than solid ones. I worked on it for 2 years in my spare time, which engineers have less of than anyone realizes. I filed the paperwork myself, typed the technical disclosure on a machine I borrowed from my neighbor, mailed it with a check for the filing fee that cleared my account to under $20. I forgot about it because life is the thing that happens while you are building something. 30-some years later, on a cold Tuesday night in a parking lot, the thing I had built without knowing I had built it came looking for me. I bought a house in the spring, nothing dramatic. A 3-bedroom in a neighborhood with old trees and sidewalks, the kind of house where the owners before you grew a garden in the backyard and left the raised beds in place. I planted tomatoes. I don't particularly like gardening, but it turned out I needed something to do with my hands in the mornings. My granddaughter came to visit in July with my son and his wife. She is 2.5 and very serious about things that are funny and very unconcerned about things that seem important, which I have decided is the correct way to be. She found the garden immediately and sat down in the dirt next to the tomato plants and looked at me with absolute authority and said, "Mine." "Yes," I told her. "Yours. I think about the parking lot sometimes. The cold, The granola bars, the clock on my phone showing 2% battery. I think about the version of myself who sat in that truck and believed that this was where things ended up, that 63 was old enough to be done. That 22 years of building something with a man who turned out not to be who I thought he was had used up whatever I had in me. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in the specific way that tired people are wrong when they mistake exhaustion for evidence. The detective sent me a card after everything resolved. Handwritten, which surprised me. He said he had been doing the job for 19 years and my case was one he would tell his kids about someday. I put it in the drawer in the kitchen where I keep things that matter. I think about what the officer must have seen on his screen in that cruiser. A man in a 1998 truck with a duffel bag and a gas station dinner and a face that said he had run out of runway, and then the flag, and then a number that had no business being attached to that truck or that parking lot or that particular November night. I don't know what I believe about things like that. I'm an engineer. I was trained to trust what can be measured. But I have started to think there are some accounts that just refuse to stay buried. Some things you put in the ground 30 years ago because you were busy and young and you didn't know what you had and they keep growing anyway. Quietly, underground, in the way things grow when no one is watching them. You forget about them. They don't forget about you. My son called last week to say that my granddaughter had asked about me. She had pointed at a photograph of the two of us in the garden and said his name for me, which is a sound she invented, not a real word, but entirely specific to me. He said she carried the photo around the apartment for a day. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. 63 years old, a parking lot, a flashlight in my face, and here is where it led. Here is what was waiting on the other side of the worst year I have lived. Here's the number my mother's maiden name unlocked. I don't know what you're carrying tonight, or how long you've been carrying it. I don't know what someone took from you, or how long ago, or how good a job they did of making you believe there was nothing left. But I drove myself to a parking lot and I thought I was at the end of something. Turns out I was at the beginning. I just didn't know it yet.